The desert at night is not quiet. People think it is, but that's because they've never stayed long enough to hear what truly wakes when the heat drains from the sand and the sky turns black. The wind begins to whisper, the earth begins to breathe, and sometimes, if you stand alone out there long enough, you'll hear footsteps behind you, even though you know no one else should be out that far. That was what troubled Mason Doyle the most. Not the stars that hung too close, not the cold that clung to his bones, not even the abandoned ritual circle he'd stumbled across years earlier. What haunted him was the memory of those footsteps, slow, dragging, deliberate, following him all the way back to his truck that night. He told himself it was an animal, a trick of the wind, his imagination. But the desert Texas keeps its secrets poorly. And now, 15 years later, the woman he'd once seen standing at that ritual circle, pale, silent, motionless, had returned. She had been alone in the dead center of the ring, her back turned, her hands covered in sand. Everyone assumed she died out there. Mason knew better, because last night, she knocked on his door. The knocking came just after 2:14 a.m., a time when no honest person visits another's home. Mason had been drifting towards sleep, the air conditioner groaning against the West Texas heat, when the sound jolted him upright. 3 solid knocks, spaced perfectly apart, like someone counting under their breath between each strike. He froze. No one lived near him. His nearest neighbor was 4 miles south. Visitors did not stop by without calling first, and nobody, absolutely nobody, should be out walking this far at night. The knocks came again. Mason swung his legs over the bed and felt the familiar ache of old injuries from years of working oil field jobs. He grabbed the flashlight he kept near the nightstand, its beam weak but steady enough to cut through the dark. As he crept down the hallway, the boards beneath him creaked in the places he always forgot to repair. When he reached the door, he hesitated. The desert outside was silent, too silent. Then a voice drifted through the wood. "Mason, I came back." His blood ran cold. He recognized that voice. It belonged to a woman who should have been dead for over a decade. Ilara Voss, the witch of the Mesa. Mason didn't open the door right away. He stood with his hand on the deadbolt, frozen in the thick, breathless silence that pressed against the house. The voice on the other side sounded exactly as he remembered. Soft, dry, desert wind thin, but older, almost hollow, like it had been pulled up from beneath the earth. He slowly turned the bolt, feeling each metal click echo in his chest, and cracked the door open no more than an inch. A sliver of moonlight spilled across the threshold and revealed the shape standing on his porch. At first he thought it was a stranger, thin frame, tangled black hair, clothes drenched in dust. But then she lifted her face and the years peeled away like smoke. It was her, Ilara Voss, the woman everyone in town had whispered about, the one he'd seen in the ritual circle all those years earlier, the one who disappeared into the desert and was never found. She looked unchanged, and yet impossibly altered. Her eyes were dark, rimmed with cracked desert grit, and her skin carried the colorless dryness of something that had forgotten how to bleed. She didn't smile, she only watched him, as if she were waiting for his recognition to settle into fear. And it did, because Mason remembered the way she'd stared at him 15 years ago, whispering in a language the sand seemed to swallow. He remembered the way she called the desert hungry, and now she stood on his porch like she'd simply walked out of a memory that never ended. "Ilara," Mason whispered, barely able to force the name out. Her lips lifted just enough to show the shape of a smile, but there was no warmth in it, only knowledge, ancient and cold. "You left me there," she said quietly, "but I didn't leave you." A chill scraped down Mason's spine. Whatever stood outside his door, they both knew it wasn't just the woman he'd once seen in the ritual circle. She had come back with something that followed her out of the desert. Mason stepped back without realizing he had moved, his hand still gripping the door as Ilara drifted past him and into the house. She didn't walk so much as slide, her feet barely lifting, her steps leaving faint trails of sand across the hardwood floor. He closed the door automatically, his pulse thudding like footsteps inside his skull. The air in the room shifted when she entered, as though something vast and wordless had come in with her, shrinking the space around them. Ilara looked around slowly, her fingers grazing the framed photographs on the wall, pausing only when she reached the old picture of Mason's father. She touched the glass with a slow, reverent motion, and more grains of desert sand fell from her hand, pattering softly onto the floorboards. He swallowed hard. Ilara, how did you survive out there? She turned her head toward him, her hair falling in rope-like strands across her face, and for a moment he saw something move under her skin, like a shadow shifting under parchment. Her eyes remained empty, unreadable. Survive? She echoed, as if the word was foreign to her. No, Mason, I didn't survive. I changed. Before he could ask what she meant, he heard it, the faint, dry hiss of shifting sand. But it wasn't coming from her clothes or her shoes. It was coming from the dark corners of the room, rolling in slow spirals across the floor, gathering behind her feet like something alive and patient. Mason felt the temperature drop as she stepped further inside, her presence leaving a trail of cold that clung to his skin. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get out of his own house, but he stood rooted in place as she turned to him fully. "The desert remembers you," she whispered, "and it's been waiting." A pulse of dread spread through the room, quiet, heavy, suffocating. Mason felt it press against his lungs, against the walls, against the very foundation of the house he had built with his own hands. Outside, the wind rose suddenly, striking the windows like a warning. Inside, the sand kept gathering.
Mason backed toward the kitchen without meaning to, one slow step at a time, his hand brushing against the counter as if the solid edge of it could anchor him. Ilara followed, not quickly, not threateningly, but with a deliberate calm that unsettled him more than any sudden violence could have. She moved like someone who had all the time in the world, like someone who didn't fear the dark, because she had brought something darker with her. The sand thickened around her feet, spreading across the floor in thin, branching veins that reached toward each doorway as if mapping the house. Mason's breath caught when he realized the sand wasn't drifting aimlessly. It was flowing in patterns, spirals, arcs, broken symbols he half remembered from that night in the desert 15 years ago. "Ilara, what do you want from me?" he asked, though the answer clawed at the back of his mind already. She paused, her shoulders rising and falling in a slow, tired breath. "I need you to listen," she said, voice soft, hoarse. "The ritual I began, I never finished it. You interrupted it. You remember, don't you?" He did, but it came to him like a bruise finally surfacing. The flash of lantern light, her kneeling in the sand, the ring of stones, the patterns carved into the earth, the sound of her chanting, low, rhythmic, wrong, and then him calling out her name, breaking her focus, making the circle collapse like a dying star. The wind had roared. The sand had moved like water. Some presence had surged from beneath the earth, reaching, grasping, hungering. Mason still remembered the shape it made in the darkness, bending the air around it. Ilara took another step toward him, and the sand followed like a loyal shadow. "When you interrupted the circle, you tore open what I was binding. It latched onto me. It marked me, and it has been feeding ever since. Through me, through the desert, through every place the wind carries its voice. I didn't know. I didn't mean." She raised her hand, silencing him with nothing more than a tilt of her fingers. "Intent doesn't matter. What's done is done, but you were part of it, and now the ritual is tied to you too." Mason felt a numbness crawl up his spine. Tied? How? Her eyes lifted, and for the first time he saw something in them, a faint, dim shimmer, like a fire buried beneath ash, not glowing, not supernatural, just human exhaustion wielded by something inhuman. "It wants you back. The desert wants what it was promised." The wind slammed against the house, every window rattling at once. The sand on the floor surged toward the doorways as if pulled by a breath none of them could hear. And Mason realized the truth. He hadn't escaped that night. He'd been given time. Mason stumbled backward until his spine pressed against the refrigerator door, the cold metal shocking him into stillness. His hands were shaking, though he didn't realize how badly until he looked down at them and saw the dust clinging to his skin. Fine red desert sand, as if he'd been kneeling in it only moments ago. He tried brushing it off, but it smeared instead, smudging into the lines of his palms. And under the smear something darker showed through. A shape. No, an impression. A faint ring, no bigger than a coin, burned into his flesh. He felt no pain, only a deep, slow throb like a heartbeat that didn't belong to him. Ilara's gaze fell to his hands. She didn't look surprised. She looked resigned. It's been there since that night. You just couldn't see it before. Not until the desert called you again. Mason pushed himself away from the fridge, heart hammering. No, I would have noticed something like this. It hides, she said softly. The mark only reveals itself when the circle is awakening. The room seemed to darken at her words, shadows thickening along the corners, bending in ways shadows shouldn't bend. Mason lifted his hand toward the overhead light and the ring beneath his skin pulsed, once, twice, synchronizing with the wind outside, as if responding to a signal. He felt a pressure then, behind his ribs, subtle but unmistakable, like someone unseen was leaning their weight into him. A slow, invisible push. He exhaled in a trembling breath. Ilara, what does it want from me? She stepped closer, her movements quiet and delicate, as though she were afraid the wrong step might break something fragile between them. When she reached him, she rested her fingers lightly over the mark on his hand. Her touch was ice cold. Too cold. Too cold. It wants completion, she whispered. The ritual must end, Mason. You started it with me, whether you meant to or not. And now it pulls you because it recognizes you as part of the offering. Offering? The word drained the air from his lungs. Her expression did not soften. Something has to fill the circle. It always takes what breaks it. And you broke it. Mason's stomach dropped. The wind outside roared again, shaking the house as though something enormous pressed its weight against the walls. The sand on the floor began to gather more quickly, swirling around Ilara's ankles like a living tide. And Mason understood, with a coldness that settled deep into his bones. The desert hadn't sent Ilara as a warning. It had sent her as a collector. The house groaned as if something heavy were settling onto its roof, something broad enough to cover the entire structure, something that shifted its weight like a creature testing the strength of its prey. Mason felt the pressure before he heard the sound. A low vibration hummed through the floorboards, traveling up his legs, into his ribs, rattling his breath. The air thickened, dry as bone, scraping the back of his throat with every inhale. He coughed, staggered, and saw a thin stream of sand trickling from the air vent above the stove. For a moment he thought the ductwork had failed. Then another vent began to leak. Then another. Sand poured from them like hourglasses tipping over one by one. Within seconds, the kitchen blurred into shifting layers of red dust. Mason shielded his eyes, stumbling backward as the grains coated his skin, his hair, the inside of his mouth. The sand wasn't random. It streamed in long, deliberate lines, gathering in spirals on the floor, forming shapes that writhed into new forms every time he blinked. Ilara stood perfectly still at the center of it, her clothes whipping around her in the rising indoor wind, her hair lifting as though she were underwater. The sand avoided her, swirling around her legs like she occupied a space the desert recognized, claimed. "Ilara, make it stop!" he shouted over the rising roar. Her lips parted just slightly. "It's not me. It's answering you." The mark on Mason's hand burned, not painfully, but insistently, like someone gripping his wrist from the inside and pulling. He looked down and saw the ring glowing faintly beneath his skin, visible even through the dust. Panic surged through him as the floor bulged beneath his boots, the sand rising in small mounds that cracked open, releasing dry gusts that smelled of ancient earth. The lights flickered, went out. In the sudden darkness, the sand glowed faintly, not with color, but with movement. Trails of shifting grains traced symbols on the floor, the walls, the ceiling, as if invisible fingers were writing through the entire house. Mason stumbled backward into the kitchen table, knocking it over, his pulse pounding in his ears. And through the roar of the sandstorm swallowing his home, he heard something else, something deeper, older, moving beneath the sound. A voice. Low, massive, speaking in a language that seemed carved out of stone and breathless wind. Mason couldn't understand the words, but he understood the intention. It was calling him. The house shuddered as the desert itself pushed inward, filling every inch of space until Mason could barely see Ilara's outline through the storm. "Mason," she whispered, her voice somehow clear despite the chaos. "You have to come with me, back to the circle, back to where it began." He shook his head violently, but the sand moved with purpose, forming a path toward the front door, a path that pulsed like a heartbeat. His heartbeat. The ritual wasn't waiting anymore. It was coming to claim him.
Mason didn't remember making the decision to move. His body simply obeyed the pull, in instinctive, terrified surrender to the force dragging at the mark beneath his skin. The sand parted for him as he stumbled toward the front door, shifting like a tide retreating from his footsteps. Ilara followed silently, the storm bending around her in a strange, unnatural arc, as if she were the eye of whatever was consuming the house. When Mason pulled the door open, the desert night slammed into him with a heat so dry it felt like inhaling fire. But beneath the heat lay something colder, a presence woven into the wind that brushed against his face with an almost curious touch. The porch steps groaned as he descended, gripping the rail to steady himself. The yard beyond was barely visible, dust swirling so thick it blurred the world into shades of red and black. Yet in front of him, a narrow path had formed, sand pressed down as though countless unseen footsteps had already walked it. It led straight toward the old service road that stretched miles into the desert, ending at the base of the mesa he'd tried so hard to forget. "Mason," Ilara called softly behind him, "don't resist anymore. You only make it stronger when you fight." He didn't turn to look at her. He was afraid of what her face might be doing now. He was afraid of what part of her still belonged to the woman he remembered, and what part did not. He stepped off the porch, and the world changed. The night grew silent. No cicadas, no coyotes, no rustling brush. Even the wind paused, as though the desert were holding its breath. Mason began walking down the dead road, his boots sinking into the soft sand in places where asphalt should have been. The pavement looked wrong, sunken in spots, split open in others, as though something beneath it had shifted violently over the years. Ilara walked beside him without sound, her bare feet leaving no prints. The moon hung low, a thin sickle barely slicing through the haze, giving the landscape a sickly, bruised hue. Shadows pooled where they shouldn't, stretching too far, bending at angles that made Mason's stomach twist. He kept his eyes on the road, but the desert felt closer with each step, as if the horizon were shrinking around them. "You remember the circle?" Ilara asked quietly. Mason nodded stiffly. "You remember what I said before it collapsed?" The memory tightened around him like a rope. Her voice, 15 years younger. "I'm not summoning anything, Mason. I'm returning with the desert lost." He hadn't understood then. He still didn't, but he was beginning to fear the answer. As they walked, the mark on his hand pulsed again, drawing Mason's gaze down. The ring beneath his skin glowed faintly, illuminating his palm with a dull, reddish hue, matching the color of the sand beneath their feet. The desert was claiming him, piece by piece, one heartbeat at a time. Ahead, the mesa rose out of the landscape, tall, dark, silent, like a vast stone altar waiting for someone who had been gone too long. Mason swallowed hard. The desert road ended there, and he knew with a cold, certain dread, so would something else. Night had fully swallowed the desert by the time Daniel reached the ritual site again.
the scattered stones and half-buried symbols illuminated only by the thinnest sliver of moonlight. The air hummed with a low, trembling vibration, like the desert itself was holding its breath. He stepped closer, sand crunching beneath his boots, and every instinct told him to turn away, but the shadows around the circle seemed to tug at him, inviting, daring, warning. The remnants of the witch's ritual were still there. The soot-blackened marks on the ground, the melted candles hardened into strange, warped spirals, and the faint outline of a figure burned into the earth as though something had stood there long enough to sear itself into the desert's memory. He felt the temperature drop, not sharply, but in a long, sliding descent that crept over his skin like a hand pressing gently against the back of his neck. He swallowed, stepped inside the circle, and the moment his foot touched the center, the sand shifted. Not blown, not disturbed by wind, shifted on its own, as if something beneath it were stirring, slowly waking. The desert stretched out silent around him, but inside the circle, the air thickened, muffled, cocooned, and Daniel felt an enormous, ancient attention turned toward him. Then he heard it, faint at first like whispers caught between grains of sand, growing clearer, layered, too many voices speaking as one. They weren't coming from around him, they were rising from below. Daniel froze as the whispers coiled upward, circling him, tightening like a noose made of words he didn't understand. He felt the ground pulse once, then again, like a living heartbeat underneath his feet. The symbols around the perimeter glowed faintly, not with light, but with heat, as though the lines themselves were smoldering beneath the sand. His breath trembled out through clenched teeth as he realized the truth. The witch's ritual had never ended. The circle wasn't abandoned. It was ongoing, perpetual, feeding on whoever dared to stand in its center. The desert around him flickered in his vision, blurring as though his eyes were being pulled towards something unseen, and a pressure settled behind his skull, heavy and insistent. A shape began forming in the sand at the edge of the circle, slow, deliberate, rising like a figure pushing itself through from beneath the surface. Daniel backed away instinctively, but the circle tightened around him, the air constricting, the whispers sharpening. He wanted to run, but the moment he moved, the entire space reacted, vibrating with a low moan like an ancient door opening after centuries of being sealed shut. The figure in the sand rose higher, its outline faint but unmistakably human, carved from dust and shadow. Daniel felt the presence of the witch, not behind him, not around him, everywhere, woven into the very air he breathed. The truth struck him with horrifying clarity. She had never needed a body to return. The ritual had transformed her into something endless, something that lived inside the desert itself. And Daniel, standing within the circle she created, had become part of the ritual the moment he stepped inside. Daniel stumbled backward, sand sliding beneath his boots as the shadow figure rose fully from the desert floor, its form made of dust that pulsed as though breathing. The whispers crescendoed into a low, unified chant, hundreds of voices speaking a language too old to belong to any living tongue. The air thickened until it felt like he was breathing through cotton, each inhale shallow and trembling. His pulse hammered in his ears, and for the first time since stepping into the wasteland, Daniel felt truly trapped, not by the desert, not by the circle, but by something ancient that had been waiting far longer than he had been alive. The figure stepped toward him, its form shedding grains of sand that floated, suspended, refusing to fall. And in the hollow where a face should have been, something glowed faintly, amber, burning like an ember that refused to die. Daniel whispered, "What do you want?" But the desert swallowed his voice whole. The figure reached out, not with malice, not with desperation, but with purpose. And in a rush of cold air, the whispers fell silent. A new sound rose, a long, slow exhale from beneath the earth, as if something that had been dormant was finally allowed to breathe. Daniel staggered, as the circle beneath him lit with faint pulsing warmth. Not fiery, not blinding, just a low throb like a heartbeat awakening after years of stillness. He felt it move through him, into him, as if the ritual was rewriting the space around his very bones. The shadow figure stepped back, dissolving into the desert wind like smoke unraveling, and Daniel felt an icy realization settle into his mind. He hadn't interrupted the ritual. He had completed it. The desert shifted, not with movement, but with awareness. The dunes around him stood taller, the air heavier as though the land itself had opened new eyes. Daniel fell to his knees, sand gripping him like water, pulling lightly, slowly, as though testing the weight of him, the worth of him. And in that suffocating silence, he understood the truth the locals had whispered about. Every ritual requires an anchor. The witch hadn't returned to reclaim her body. She had returned to claim another. Someone to carry the circle forward, to keep it alive, to ensure the old magic would never fade again. Daniel felt the pressure behind his skull intensify, a silent hand pushing inward, planting something deep inside his mind like a seed destined to bloom. The wind rose without warning, swirling around him in a spiraling column, lifting grains of sand in a tight spinning cocoon. The dunes howled, the sky darkened to a deep, bruised purple, and Daniel felt the last piece of himself strain, tear, snap. When the wind fell silent at last, he stood slowly, his movements too smooth, too deliberate. The desert was quiet again, comfortably, eternally quiet. Daniel's eyes moved toward the horizon, but they were no longer his eyes. They carried an old knowing, a ritual's memory, a witch's hunger. The desert had chosen him. And when travelers came weeks later, lost in the same winds that once carried Daniel's footsteps, they found the circle still etched into the sand, fresh, warm, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. They whispered about the figure they saw watching from the ridge, a silhouette unmoving, patient, as though rooted to the land itself. Some said it was a man. Others swore it wasn't a man at all, but all agreed on one thing. The desert remembers. It always remembers.